Oscar Piastri just set the fastest lap of the first day in Australia. The home crowd exploded. McLaren suddenly on top, and the entire paddock started asking the same question. Has McLaren just taken the lead in the 2026 season? But inside the Red Bull garage, something very different was happening. Because when engineers opened Max Verstappen's telemetry, they noticed a pattern hidden inside Piastri's lap. A pattern in the acceleration data. A pattern that did not look normal. In fact, it looked dangerous. Not because the lap was fast, but because of where the speed was coming from. And the moment Verstappen saw those numbers, the story of this Australian Grand Prix suddenly became much bigger than a single fastest lap. Because if that telemetry is correct, it could mean one team has already unlocked something the others are still struggling to understand. And that changes everything about this weekend. So before we break down what Verstappen's telemetry actually revealed, and why engineers across the paddock are now studying Piastri's lap very carefully, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because what happened in Melbourne today might be the first real clue of who controls the 2026 Formula 1 season. To understand why Verstappen's telemetry raised eyebrows inside the Red Bull garage, we need to start with the bigger picture. Because the Australian Grand Prix this year is not just the first race of the season. It is the first real test of an entirely new Formula 1 era. New regulations, new hybrid systems, new power unit philosophies, and perhaps most importantly, new uncertainties. Every team arrived in Melbourne with simulations, wind tunnel numbers, and testing data. But practice in Australia is the first moment where all those theories finally meet reality. And reality looked very interesting from the very first session. Ferrari immediately showed strong pace. The car looked stable through the fast corners, balanced under braking, and very consistent over multiple laps. Mercedes also looked comfortable. Calm, methodical, almost clinical in the way they executed their program. But the real surprise of the day came from McLaren. Oscar Piastri, racing in front of his home crowd, suddenly appeared at the top of the timing screens. Fastest lap of the session. A lap that immediately grabbed headlines across the paddock. The grandstands erupted. The cameras followed the McLaren garage. And suddenly the narrative of the weekend started to form. McLaren looks quick. Very quick. But inside the Red Bull garage, the mood was more analytical than emotional. Because their Friday had already been complicated. The RB22, Red Bull's brand new car for the 2026 era, was experiencing a very different kind of day. A day that looked fast in moments, but messy in others. During the first practice session the car appeared reasonably competitive. Max Verstappen finished near the front. The RB22 looked balanced enough. Nothing dramatic. No visible reliability issues. Which was already important. Because this car represents something completely new for the team. For the first time in their history, Red Bull is running a power unit developed under their own program together with Ford. A massive engineering challenge. Thousands of components. New hybrid architecture. Complex electrical systems. And a completely different integration between engine and chassis. For years Red Bull relied on the Honda platform that powered their dominant championship runs. That combination delivered performance, reliability, and an almost perfect balance between power and aerodynamics. Now everything is different. And that makes every lap in these early sessions incredibly valuable. Every lap teaches engineers something about the car. How it deploys electrical energy. How it cools the battery systems. How stable the aerodynamic platform remains at high speed. Which is why what happened in the second practice session became such a problem. Only a few minutes after the session started, Verstappen left the garage and rolled down the pit lane. Then suddenly, the RB22 stopped. Completely stopped. Right at the pit lane exit. The car shut down beneath him. Mechanics rushed toward the car. Marshals helped push it back into the garage. And just like that, a huge portion of the session was lost. More than 20 minutes disappeared while engineers tried to understand the issue. In a session that only lasts 1 hour, that kind of delay is extremely costly. Especially when you are still learning a brand new car. While other teams continued running their programs, Red Bull was stuck in the garage. And when Verstappen finally returned to the track, the team was already behind schedule. But the real turning point of the session came only a few laps later. Pushing through one of the faster sections of Albert Park, the RB22 suddenly snapped. A sudden moment of oversteer. The rear stepping out violently. Verstappen ran wide onto the grass. Then bounced through the gravel trap. The car shaking violently as pieces of the floor broke away. It was not a huge crash. But it was damaging. Because in modern Formula 1, the floor of the car generates most of the downforce. Even small damage can dramatically reduce aerodynamic performance. From that moment forward, the RB22 was no longer operating at its full potential. And yet, despite losing track time, despite the damaged floor, despite a disrupted program, Verstappen still finished the session only a few tenths behind the fastest lap. And that fastest lap belonged to Oscar Piastri. But when Red Bull engineers overlaid Verstappen's telemetry with Piastri's data, something immediately stood out. A pattern hidden inside the acceleration traces. A pattern that suggested McLaren might have already unlocked something extremely powerful in the new 2026 power unit era. And that realization is what made Verstappen's engineers look at that fastest lap very differently. When Red Bull engineers overlaid the telemetry from Verstappen's lap with the data from Piastri's fastest run, one detail immediately stood out. Not the top speed. Not the braking zones. The difference appeared somewhere far more revealing. Corner exits. Every time both cars accelerated out of slower corners, the pattern looked different. The McLaren seemed to explode forward. Almost like a short burst of extra power. Not dramatically faster over the entire straight, but incredibly strong in the first seconds of acceleration. And in modern Formula One, that specific pattern usually points to one thing: energy deployment. Because under the new 2026 regulations, electrical power is no longer just an assistance to the engine. It is a central part of the performance equation. Teams must carefully decide where the electrical energy is released during the lap. Deploy too early, and the battery drains before the end of the straight. Deploy too late, and you lose precious acceleration out of the corner. It is a constant balancing act. And according to the telemetry patterns that engineers studied in Melbourne, McLaren looked extremely confident with their deployment strategy. Very aggressive. Very optimized. The car was releasing energy at exactly the moments where traction and acceleration matter most. And that creates the sensation that the car is launching out of corners. Which is exactly what many observers noticed during Piastri's fastest lap. The car looked sharp, responsive, almost explosive. Meanwhile, the RB22 showed a slightly different behavior. Fast, yes, but more progressive. The acceleration curve was smoother. Less aggressive in the first meters after the apex. And that detail might reveal something important about Red Bull's current situation. Because this is the first season of their new power unit project. The Red Bull Ford partnership. A completely new hybrid architecture. New battery technology. New deployment software. And when a system like that is brand new, teams often start the season cautiously. Engineers protect the hardware. They avoid aggressive energy release. They gather data. They study temperatures. They observe battery behavior. Only after understanding those limits do they begin unlocking the full performance. That could explain why Verstappen's telemetry looked slightly more conservative. But there is another possibility. A more worrying one. Some analysts inside the paddock have quietly suggested that Red Bull's electrical deployment might not yet be as strong as some of their rivals. Especially compared with Mercedes and possibly McLaren. If that turns out to be true, it would explain the pattern seen in Melbourne. Because on circuits like Albert Park, acceleration out of corners is everything. Short straights. Multiple traction zones. Constant bursts of power. If one car deploys electrical energy more efficiently in those moments, the advantage becomes very visible. And that is why Verstappen's engineers studied Piastri's lap so carefully. Because sometimes the fastest lap of the day reveals more than just speed. It reveals how a team is using its technology. And that information can be extremely valuable. But here is the twist that makes this story even more intriguing. Despite the strange day, despite losing more than 20 minutes in the garage, despite damaging the floor of the car after running through the gravel, Verstappen still finished less than 7 tenths away from Piastri's fastest time. Which suggests something very important. The RB22 might still be far from its true potential. Because if a compromised car can stay that close to the front, imagine what happens when the car runs a clean session. When the setup window improves. When the energy deployment maps become more aggressive. Suddenly the entire competitive picture could change. And that possibility is exactly why Verstappen did not sound worried after Friday. Instead, he sounded analytical. Focused. Almost patient. Because in Formula One, the most dangerous situation for your rivals is not when a champion is already fast. It is when that champion is still learning. And right now, Max Verstappen might still be discovering just how much performance the RB22 actually has hidden inside. But the telemetry story does not end with acceleration. Because when engineers continued analyzing the data from Friday, another pattern started to appear. A pattern that could explain why Verstappen suddenly lost the rear of the RB22 during that scary moment in the fast section of the track. When the car snapped into oversteer and bounced through the gravel. To understand this, engineers look at something called throttle stability. Not simply how hard the driver presses the throttle, but how stable the power delivery remains when the driver begins accelerating out of a corner. And here the RB22 revealed something interesting. When Verstappen began applying throttle, the power curve was slightly less predictable than expected. Small fluctuations, tiny variations in torque delivery. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make the rear of the car feel nervous when the tires are already on the edge of grip. And that matters enormously in a circuit like Albert Park, because the track surface is still evolving during the first day. Grip levels are inconsistent. Dust and rubber are constantly changing the balance of the car, which means any irregularity in power delivery can suddenly destabilize the rear axle. Now combine that with another factor. The RB22 lost part of its floor after the gravel excursion, and that floor is responsible for generating most of the car's downforce. When the airflow underneath the car becomes disturbed, the rear loses aerodynamic stability, which means the driver has less support when accelerating out of corners. Less downforce, less grip, less confidence. That combination can easily produce the kind of snap-oversteer Verstappen experienced during the session. But here is where things become even more fascinating. Because when the engineers compared Verstappen's throttle traces with Piastri's fastest lap, another difference appeared. The McLaren looked incredibly smooth. The power delivery seemed almost perfectly linear. Every time Piastri pressed the throttle, the acceleration curve rose steadily. No sudden spikes. No small interruptions. Just a clean surge of power. And when a driver feels that kind of consistency, confidence grows immediately. The driver can apply throttle earlier, carry more speed through the corner, attack the exits more aggressively. That alone can produce several tenths of a second across a lap. But there is still one more layer to this telemetry story. Because the final sector of Albert Park revealed something that might be even more important. Despite McLaren's strong acceleration earlier in the lap, Verstappen's car actually looked very competitive in the higher speed sections. The RB22 maintained strong speed once the car was fully settled, which suggests something critical about the design philosophy of this new Red Bull. The car might be optimized for efficiency, less drag, cleaner airflow, better high-speed stability. And if that is true, the RB22 could become extremely dangerous over longer runs. Because races are not won with a single explosive lap. They are won with consistency, with tire management, with stable performance across many laps. And that is exactly where Red Bull cars have historically been very strong. Which leads to a fascinating possibility. What if the RB22 is not designed to dominate on Friday? What if its real strength only appears when the race pace begins to matter? Because if the power unit temperatures remain stable, if the aerodynamic platform improves once the setup is refined, and if the energy deployment maps become more aggressive over the weekend, then the car that looked slightly vulnerable on Friday could suddenly become the most dangerous car on the grid by Sunday. And that possibility is exactly why Verstappen did not react with frustration after the session. He reacted like a driver studying a puzzle. Because sometimes the most important thing revealed by telemetry is not the weakness of your car. It is the potential that still has not been unlocked. And right now, after the first day of the 2026 season in Australia, Max Verstappen might be sitting on far more hidden performance than anyone in the paddock fully realizes.